Hello, welcome to this documentary on Cuba. I'm Luke Martin.
And I'm Max Stover. We will look at the last 50 years in Cuba's economy, education, environment, tourism, and social human. Cuba is a small island economy the size of Tennessee and finds itself in the crossroads of world history and the global economy. The economy of Cuba is a planned economy that is dominated by a state-run monopoly or enterprise. Fidel Castro implemented his socialist economic policy, which has led to no economic growth for the last 50 years. In Cuba, the government owns most of the industries and the state employs a labor force. After following the fall of the Soviet Union, the Communist Party encouraged the start of cooperative businesses that are now owned and self-managed by the workers as well as self-employment. However, in the year 2000, public sector employment dominated with a 76% workforce and private sector employment. Mainly self-employment was 23%. This is almost a complete reversal from the 1981 economy where self-employment was at 91% and the public sector was at 8%. The government sets most prices and rations goods to citizens. The costs are low for housing and transportation. Cubans receive free education, healthcare, and food subsidies. Investment is restricted and requires approval by the government. Cuba's economy got a jolt in December 2014, a year before Fidel Castro died. Then the U.S.-Cuban ties were restored. The U.S. Embassy has reopened in Cuba. It appears that Cuba's economy might be full steam ahead for its businesses and improvement in its economy.
The Cuban Literacy Campaign was a year-long effort to abolish illiteracy in Cuba after the Cuban Revolution, beginning on January 1st and ending on December 22nd, 1961, becoming the world's most ambitious and organized literacy campaign. Before 1959, the official literacy rate for Cuba was between 60 and 76%, largely because of lack of education in rural areas and a lack of instructors. As a result, the Cuban government of Fidel Castro dubbed 1961 the Year of Education and sent literacy brigades out into the countryside to construct schools, train new educators, and teach the predominantly illiterate peasants to read and write. The campaign was a remarkable success. By its completion, 707,212 adults were taught to read and write, raising the national literacy rate to 96%. Since then, education is free for all Cubans through the 9th grade. Uniforms are worn by the students, and education includes agricultural work, as well as military training, as well as training in the arts. Today, however, Cuba's educational system is burdened with many problems. The main problem being the lack of teachers because the salaries are so low. Many of the country schools have closed and city schools have been set up to help lower educational costs. Cuba is trying to keep education sustainable for every citizen free of charge. At the university level, special emphasis has been placed on medical studies. Over 85,000 people are pursuing a degree in medicine in Cuba today. Furthermore, Cuba has 20,000 medical doctors and 30,000 other health professionals working abroad. The money they earn for Cuba is more than tourism and family remittances combined.
Cuba has an environment with a variety of different natural habitats. Cuba has environmental issues such as water pollution and air pollution. The air pollution is serious. Cuba relies on trucks, buses, and cars, which were built before 1959. These vehicles spew endless clouds of fumes into the air. Since the Cuban government sells tobacco for revenue, cigars and cigarette smoking contaminate the air in restaurants, hotels, and homes. All these fumes are unhealthy for the Cuban people. Furthermore, water pollution occurs around farms, factories, and large cities. In most places, the water supply is safe to drink on occasion. Prolonged drinking of the water is not recommended. Havana does not smell of sewage like some other third world countries, but most of the country is old and in disrepair. In Havana, debris from the construction accumulates in the streets. The trash is dilapidation take away from the beauty and charm of the world-class city. The Cuban government has created an environmental program to educate the Cuban people on observing their environment and helping the countries clean up.
The tourist industry declined to record low levels within 2 years of Castro's ascension into power. In January 1961, relations between the nations deteriorated as a result of the new communist government, which owned banks, businesses, and the exodus of many Cuban businessmen. The United States declared travel to Cuba to be contrary to the United States foreign policy and against our national interest. Tourism that year dropped to a record low, forcing a dramatic downsizing of Cuba's tourist plans. Visitors to Cuba during the 1960s, 70s, and 80s were comparatively rare. Unlike the United States, Canada normalized relations with Cuba in the 1970s, and Canadians increasingly visited Cuba for vacations. Approximately one-third of visitors to Cuba each year are Canadians. The Cuban government has moderated its nationalization policies and allowed for private business since 2011. It has also pursued revitalization programs aimed at boosting tourism. The United States reestablished diplomatic relations with Cuba in 2015, and the tourism industry is expected to greatly benefit from these relations in the near future. Cuba has become a popular tourist attraction since the U.S. lifted the embargo. Since there is a shortage of hotels in Havana, the cruise industry is the perfect avenue for bringing tourists to Cuba and in turn boosting Cuba's economy.
In 1959, Castro established a Cuban socialist state aligned with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's collapse brought an end to the economic support of Cuba, which, combined with the U.S. embargo, created an economic crisis in the early 1990s. The Cuban government was unstable and desired to maintain control. This desire overrode the rights of Cuban citizens. These events are the background for the lack of fundamental human rights in Cuba today. Cuba's legal system limits civil and political rights, such as the freedom to assemble, freedom of religion, and freedom of expression. Opposition is seen as a crime to the Cuban government. The government believes actions such as torture, detention, and imprisonment are justified in order to keep the peace. The government also controls economic and social rights. While Cuba is committed to education and free health care for all citizens, only curriculum with Marxist principles is allowed. The government also controls the one labor union and business production. Other countries have spoken out to the living conditions in Cuba. The U.S. has tried to impose many sanctions on Cuba over the last 40 years to try and stop the inhumane treatment of the Cuban citizens. Since Castro's death and the U.S. and Cuban ties restored, there is hope for Cuban citizens to enjoy the essential human freedom.
In conclusion, Cuba has survived 50 years under communist rule, coupled with heavy U.S. sanctions intended to oust its leader. Since Fidel Castro's death, new leadership and a new U.S.-Cuban relationship may lead Cuba to a more prosperous future. Thank you for your time.